Now, let's drift off to sleep. Today, you'll be falling asleep during a thunderstorm inside of a cozy camper trailer next to a lake in the mountains. Imagine you are feeling exhausted, hot, and sweaty as you return to your camper. You've just conquered your long-held dream of hiking to the very summit of Moonrest Mountain. You've changed into your swimsuit and are now standing at the edge of the dock on weary, trembling legs, ready to celebrate your incredible achievement with a refreshing dive into the cool, crystal-clear waters of Silver Lake. With your arms raised above your head and ready to dive in, you glance at the slow-moving dark clouds on the horizon. Beads of sweat are still clinging to your forehead when you push off the dock and soar through the air before gliding perfectly into the water. The crisp, cool water envelops you, gently massaging your entire being. You can almost taste the clean, mineral freshness of the water as it washes away all the sweat, dust, and grime from your skin. While breathing in deeply, you are met with the glorious sense of renewal. You feel utterly refreshed and rejuvenated. You swim back to the dock and climb the cool aluminum ladder. Then, standing there with a soft cotton towel draped around your shoulders, you gaze out across the deep blue lake. Here and there, motorboats, canoes, sailboats, and jet skis are now headed towards the shores. Everyone knows rain is coming. Kids wearing life vests and learning how to water ski are hoisted back into boats, and the small, colorful sails of dinghies flutter in the breeze as their little suntanned captains point them back towards land. Now, all toweled off and feeling a little bit chilled, you walk barefoot back to your camper ahead of the rain. At the little picnic table, you collect your book, coffee mug, and sunglasses. You gather up other items and place them into a plastic tote. A salt and pepper shaker, a box of wooden matches, some paper plates. You secure the lid on the tote and move the Coleman lantern under the table. At the fire pit, you fold up your camping chair and tuck it below the protective cover of a tall ponderosa pine. Then you return to your camper, open the door, and step inside. In the little kitchenette, you set water to boil for tea. And then you change into your favorite, coziest leisure wear. while the hot tea steeps, you settle at the quaint table and gaze out the window, watching as boats reach the shore and families hurry off to their campers and tents and cabins. Now, with a warm cup of tea in hand and nestled in your soft, comfy clothes, you feel your body slowly warming again. You bring the mug to your lips. The fragrant steam curls around your face as you take a tiny sip. The tea is smooth, rich, and the perfect temperature. You take a bigger sip, and the tea flows down to your core, melting away the chill from the lake. A rush of warmth spreads throughout your body, like a wave of little goosebumps, and you're suddenly filled with a sense of deep accomplishment, peace, and satisfaction. Now, as you sit here at Silver Lake, let's prepare for sleep. First, close your eyes and simply become aware of your breathing, feeling your chest gently rise and fall again. Next, let's take a few deeper breaths. We will slowly fill our lungs with the cool, sweet scent of pine trees and that fresh mountain air. And then, after holding briefly, we will let it all go and exhale. Ready? Breathe in deeply, hold for 3, 2, 1, and then exhale. One more time. Breathe in deeply, hold for 3, 2, 1, and exhale. And try thinking to yourself, as I am here at Silver Lake, I can feel gravity pulling me back towards Earth. With every exhale, I can feel the slow rotation of Earth and the Earth's steady movement around the sun. I can feel my tired feet, my ankles, my fatigued calves, my knees, and my legs becoming heavier and heavier and more relaxed. You finish the last sip of your perfect tea, and then you pick up a little pencil and notebook resting on the table. With them in hand, you make your way to the sleeping nook at the other end of the camper, where you collapse heavily into the soft, wide bed. After the long, steep hike up Moonrest Mountain, the bed feels like a soft cloud beneath your tired body. The little windows by the bed are cracked open, and your nostrils catch the pleasant scent of fresh rain on pine needles and moss. You look at your notepad and observe your to-do list. Each completed task is neatly crossed out with pencil. At the bottom of the page is one final entry on this list. A smile creeps across your face as you take the pencil and begin scribbling over that last item: climb Moonrest Mountain. You set the notepad aside, thinking how perfect everything feels at this moment. You've completed everything you set out to do here. Tomorrow holds no obligations, and for now, everything is done, finished, and complete. You have earned this wonderful moment of absolute peace. Your body sinks deeper into the soft bed. Every muscle relaxes from the tips of your fingers to the soles of your tired feet as you surrender to the peace and calm and take in the rich mountain air. Let's take a few more deep breaths before drifting off to sleep. Ready? Breathe in deeply, hold for 3, 2, 1, and then exhale. One more time. Breathe in deeply, hold for 3, 2, 1, and exhale. Try thinking to yourself, as I lay here at Silver Lake, I can feel gravity pulling me back towards Earth. With every exhale, I experience my body feeling heavier and heavier and more relaxed. I can feel my tired arms, my hands, my torso, shoulders, neck, and head becoming heavier and more relaxed. My whole body feels at peace as gravity's pull tugs me gently and tucks me safely into this ever so soft bed. Now, feeling oh so satisfied, safe, accomplished, rejuvenated, sleepy, and happy, you reach over to a little transistor radio, tune it to your favorite station, then lay back and close your eyes.
Loss of the steamship Titanic. Report of a formal investigation into the circumstances attending the foundering on April 15, 1912, of the British steamship Titanic of Liverpool after striking ice in or near latitude 41 degrees 46 minutes north, longitude 50 degrees 14 minutes west, North Atlantic Ocean, whereby loss of life ensued. Section 3. Description of the damage to the ship and of its gradual and final effect, with observations thereon. The damage done to the ship was as follows. Extent of the damage. The collision with the iceberg, which took place at 11:40 p.m., caused damage to the bottom of the starboard side of the vessel at about 10 feet above the level of the keel, but there was no damage above this height. There was damage in the forepeak, number 1 hold, number 2 hold, number 3 hold, number 6 boiler room, number 5 boiler room. The damage extended over a length of about 300 feet. Time in which the damage was done. As the ship was moving at over 20 knots, she would have passed through 300 feet in less than 10 seconds, so that the damage was done in about this time. The flooding in first 10 minutes. At first, it is desirable to consider what happened in the first 10 minutes. The forepeak was not flooded above the orlop deck, that is, the peak tank top, from the hole in the bottom of the peak tank. In number 1 hold, there was 7 feet of water. In number 2 hold, 5 minutes after the collision, water was seen rushing in at the bottom of the fireman's passage on the starboard side, so that the ship's side was damaged abaft of bulkhead B sufficiently to open the side of the fireman's passage, which was 3.5 feet from the outer skin of the ship, thereby flooding both the hold and the passage. In number 3 hold, the mail room was filled soon after the collision. The floor of the mail room is 24 feet above the keel. In number 6 boiler room, when the collision took place, water at once poured in at about 2 feet above the stokehold plates, on the starboard side, at the after end of the boiler room. Some of the firemen immediately went through the watertight door opening to number 5 boiler room because the water was flooding the place. The watertight doors in the engine rooms were shut from the bridge almost immediately after the collision. 10 minutes later, it was found that there was water to the height of 8 feet above the double bottom in number 6 boiler room. Number 5 boiler room was damaged at the ship's side in the starboard forward bunker at a distance of 2 feet above the stokehold plates, at 2 feet from the watertight bulkhead between numbers 5 and 6 boiler rooms. Water poured in at that place as it would from an ordinary fire hose. At the time of the collision, this bunker had no coal in it. The bunker door was closed when water was seen to be entering the ship. In number 4 boiler room, there was no indication of any damage at the early stages of the sinking. Gradual effect of the damage. It will thus be seen that all the 6 compartments forward of number 4 boiler room were open to the sea by damage which existed at about 10 feet above the keel. At 10 minutes after the collision, the water seems to have risen to about 14 feet above the keel in all these compartments except number 5 boiler room. After the first 10 minutes, the water rose steadily in all these 6 compartments. The forepeak above the peak tank was not filled until an hour after the collision, when the vessel's bow was submerged to above sea deck. The water then flowed in from the top through the deck scuttle forward of the collision bulkhead. It was by this scuttle that access was obtained to all the decks below sea down to the peak tank top on the orlop deck. At 12 o'clock, water was coming up in number 1 hatch. It was getting into the firemen's quarters and driving the firemen out. It was rushing round number 1 hatch on G deck and coming mostly from the starboard side, so that in 20 minutes the water had risen above G deck in number 1 hold. In number 2 hold, about 40 minutes after the collision, the water was coming into the seamen's quarters on E deck through a burst fore and aft wooden bulkhead of a third-class cabin opposite the seamen's wash place. Thus, the water had risen in number 2 hold to about 3 feet above E deck in 40 minutes. In number 3 hold, the mail room was afloat about 20 minutes after the collision. The bottom of the mail room, which is on the orlop deck, is 24 feet above the keel. The watertight doors on F deck at the fore and after ends of number 3 compartment were not closed then. The mailroom was filling and water was within 2 feet of G deck, rising fast when the order was given to clear the boats. There was then no water on F deck. There is a stairway on the port side on G deck which leads down to the first-class baggage room on the orlop deck immediately below. There was water in this baggage room 25 minutes after the collision. Half an hour after the collision, water was up to G deck in the mailroom. Thus the water had risen in this compartment to within 2 feet of G deck in 20 minutes, and above G deck in 25 to 30 minutes. 10 minutes later, the water had risen to 8 feet above the top of the double bottom, and probably reached the top of the bulkhead at the after end of the compartment at the level of E deck in about 1 hour after the collision. In number 5 boiler room there was no water above the stokehold plates until a rush of water came through the pass between the boilers from the forward end and drove the leading stoker out. It has already been shown in the description of what happened in the first 10 minutes. That water was coming into number 5 boiler room in the forward starboard bunker at 2 feet above the plates in a stream about the size of a deck hose. The door in this bunker had been dropped probably when water was first discovered, which was a few minutes after the collision. This would cause the water to be retained in the bunker until it rose high enough to burst the door, which was weaker than the bunker bulkhead. This happened about an hour after the collision. Number 4 boiler room. 1 hour and 40 minutes after the collision, water was coming in forward in number 4 boiler room from underneath the floor in the forward part in small quantities. The men remained in that stokehold till ordered on deck. Numbers 3, 2, and 1 boiler rooms. When the men left number 4, some of them went through numbers 3, 2, and 1 boiler rooms into the reciprocating engine room, and from there on deck. There was no water in the boiler rooms abaft number 4 1 hour 40 minutes after the collision, 1:20 a.m., and there was then none in the reciprocating and turbine engine rooms, electrical engine room, and tunnels. There was no damage to these compartments. From the foregoing it follows that there was no damage abaft number 4 boiler room. All the watertight doors aft of the main engine room were opened after the collision. Half an hour after the collision, the watertight doors from the engine room to the stokehold were opened as far forward as they could be to number 4 boiler room. Final effect of the damage. The later stages of the sinking cannot be stated with any precision, owing to a confusion of the times which was natural under the circumstances. The forecastle deck was not under water at 1:35 a.m. Distress signals were fired until 2 hours after the collision, 1:45 a.m. At this time, the foredeck was under water. The forecastle head was not then submerged, though it was getting close down to the water, about half an hour before she disappeared, 1:50 a.m. When the last boat, lowered from davits, D, left the ship, a deck was under water, and water came up the stairway under the boat deck almost immediately afterwards. After this, the other port collapsible, B, which had been stowed on the officer's house, was uncovered, the lashings cut adrift, and she was swung round over the edge of the coamings of the deck house onto the boat deck. Very shortly afterwards, the vessel, according to Mr. Lightollers' account, seemed to take a dive, and he just walked into the water. When he came to the surface, all the funnels were above the water. Her stern was gradually rising out of the water, and the propellers were clear of the water. The ship did not break in two, and she did eventually attain the perpendicular when the second funnel from aft about reached the water. There were no lights burning then, though they kept alight practically until the last. Before reaching the perpendicular, when at an angle of 50 degrees or 60 degrees, there was a rumbling sound which may be attributed to the boilers leaving their beds and crashing down onto or through the bulkheads. She became more perpendicular and finally absolutely perpendicular when she went slowly down. After sinking as far as the after part of the boat deck, she went down more quickly. The ship disappeared at 2:20 a.m. Observations. I am advised that the Titanic as constructed could not have remained afloat long with such damage as she received. Her bulkheads were spaced to enable her to remain afloat with any two compartments in communication with the sea. She had a sufficient margin of safety with any two of the compartments flooded which were actually damaged. In fact, any three of the four forward compartments could have been flooded by the damage received without sinking the ship to the top of her bulkheads. Even if the four forward compartments had been flooded, the water would not have got into any of the compartments abaft of them, though it would have been above the top of some of the forward bulkheads. But the ship, even with these four compartments flooded, would have remained afloat. But she could not remain afloat with the four compartments and the forward boiler room, number 6, also flooded. The flooding of these 5 compartments alone would have sunk the ship sufficiently deep to have caused the water to rise above the bulkhead at the after end of the forward boiler room, number 6, and to flow over into the next boiler room, number 5, and to fill it up until in turn its after bulkhead would be overwhelmed and the water would thereby flow over and fill number 4 boiler room, and so on in succession to the other boiler rooms till the ship would ultimately fill and sink. It has been shown that water came into the 5 forward compartments to a height of about 14 feet above the keel in the first 10 minutes. This was at a rate of inflow with which the ship's pumps could not possibly have coped, so that the damage done to these 5 compartments alone inevitably sealed the doom of the ship. The damage done in the boiler rooms numbers 4 and 5 was too slight to have hastened appreciably the sinking of the ship, for it was given in evidence that no considerable amount of water was in either of these compartments for an hour after the collision. The rate at which water came into number 6 boiler room makes it highly probable that the compartment was filled in not more than an hour, after which the flow over the top of the bulkhead between 5 and 6 began and continued till number 5 was filled. It was shown that the leak in number 5 boiler room was only about equal to the flow of a deck hose pipe, about 3 inches in diameter. The leak in number 4, supposing that there was one, was only enough to admit about 3 feet of water in that compartment in 1 hour 40 minutes. Hence the leaks in numbers 4 and 5 boiler rooms did not appreciably hasten the sinking of the vessel. The evidence is very doubtful as to number 4 being damaged. The pumps were being worked in number 5 soon after the collision. The 10-inch leather special suction pipe which was carried from aft is more likely to have been carried for use in number 5 than number 4, because the doors were ordered to be opened probably soon after the collision, when water was known to be coming into number 5. There is no evidence that the pumps were being worked in number 4. The only evidence possibly favorable to the view that the pipe was required for number 4 and not for number 5 is that Scott, a greaser, says that he saw engineers dragging the suction pipe along 1 hour after the collision. But even as late as this, it may have been wanted for number 5 only. The importance of the question of the damage to number 5 is small because the ship, as actually constructed, was doomed as soon as the water in number 6 boiler room and all compartments forward of it entered in the quantities it actually did. It is only of importance in dealing with the question of what would have happened to the ship had she been more completely subdivided. It was stated in evidence that if number 4 had not been damaged, or had only been damaged to an extent within the powers of the pumps to keep under, then if the bulkheads had been carried to sea deck, the ship might have been saved. Further methods of increased subdivision and their effect upon the fate of the ship are discussed later. Evidence was given showing that after the watertight doors in the engine and boiler rooms had been all closed, except those forward of number 4 group of boilers, they were opened again, and there is no evidence to show that they were again closed. Though it is probable that the engineers who remained below would have closed these doors as the water rose in the compartments, yet it was not necessary for them to do this, as each door had an automatic closing arrangement which would have come into operation immediately a small amount of water came through the door. It is probable, however, that the life of the ship would have been lengthened somewhat if these doors had been left open, for the water would have flowed through them to the after part of the ship, and the rate of flow of the water into the ship would have been for a time reduced, as the bow might have been kept up a little by the water which flowed aft. It is thus seen that the efficiency of the automatic arrangements for the closing of the watertight doors, which was questioned during the inquiry, had no important bearing on the question of hastening the sinking of the ship, except that, in the case of the doors not having been closed by the engineers, it might have retarded the sinking of the ship if they had not acted. The engineers would not have prevented the doors from closing unless they had been convinced that the ship was doomed. There is no evidence that they did prevent the doors from closing. The engineers were applying the pumps when Barrett, leading stoker, left number 5 boiler room, but even if they had succeeded in getting all the pumps in the ship to work, they would not have saved the ship or prolonged her life to any appreciable extent. Effect of suggested additional subdivision upon flotation. Watertight decks. It is in evidence that advantage might be obtained from the point of view of greater safety in having a watertight deck. Without entering into the general question of the advantage of watertight decks for all ships, it is desirable to form an opinion in the case of the Titanic as to whether making the bulkhead deck watertight would have been an advantage in the circumstances of the accident or in case of accident to ships of this class. I am advised that it is found that with all the compartments certainly known to have been flooded, namely those forward of number 4 boiler room, the ship would have remained afloat if the bulkhead deck had been a watertight deck. If, however, number 4 boiler room had also been flooded, the ship would not have remained afloat unless, in addition to making the bulkhead deck watertight, the transverse bulkhead abaft of number 4 boiler room had been carried up to D-deck. To make the bulkhead deck effectively watertight for this purpose, it would have been necessary to carry watertight trunks round all the openings in the bulkhead deck up to sea deck. It has been shown that with the bulkhead abaft number 5 boiler room carried to sea deck, the ship would have remained afloat if the compartments certainly known to have been damaged had been flooded. I do not desire to express an opinion upon the question whether it would have conduced to safety in the case of the Titanic if a watertight deck had been fitted below the waterline, as there may be some objections to such a deck. There are many considerations involved, and I think that the matter should be dealt with by the Bulkhead Committee for ships in general. Longitudinal subdivision. The advantages and disadvantages of longitudinal subdivision by means of watertight bunker bulkheads were pointed out in evidence. While not attempting to deal with this question generally for ships, I am advised that if the Titanic had been divided in the longitudinal method instead of in the transverse method only, she would have been able, if damaged as supposed, to remain afloat, though with a list which could have been corrected by putting water ballast into suitable places. This subject is one, however, which again involves many considerations, and I think that for ships generally the matter should be referred to the Bulkhead Committee for their consideration and report. Extending double bottom up the sides. It was shown in evidence that there would be increased protection in carrying the double bottom higher up the side than was done in the Titanic, and that some of the boiler rooms would probably not then have been flooded, as water could not have entered the ship except in the double bottom. In the case of the Titanic, I am advised that this would have been an advantage, but it was pointed out in evidence that there are certain disadvantages which in some ships may outweigh the advantages. In view of what has already been said about the possible advantages of longitudinal subdivision, it is unnecessary further to discuss the question of carrying up the double bottom in ships generally. This matter should also be dealt with by the Bulkhead Committee, watertight doors. With reference to the question of the watertight doors of the ship, there does not appear to have been any appreciable effect upon the sinking of the ship caused by either shutting or not shutting the doors. There does not appear to have been any difficulty in working the watertight doors. They appear to have been shut in good time after the collision, but in other cases of damage in ships constructed like the Titanic, it is probable that the efficiency of the closing arrangement of the watertight doors may exert a vital influence on the safety of the ship. It has been represented that in future consideration should be given to the question as to how far bulkheads should be solid bulkheads, and how far there should be watertight doors, and if there should be watertight doors, how far they may or may not be automatically operated. This again is a question on which it is not necessary here to express any general opinion, for there are conflicting considerations which vary in individual cases. The matter, however, should come under the effective supervision of the Board of Trade much more than it seems to come at present, and should be referred to the Bulkhead Committee for their consideration, with a view to their suggesting in detail where doors should or should not be allowed, and the type of door which should be adopted in the different parts of ships. Section 4. Account of the saving and rescue of those who survived. The boats. The Titanic was provided with 20 boats. They were all on the boat deck. 14 were lifeboats. These were hung inboard in davits, 7 on the starboard side and 7 on the port side, and were designed to carry 65 persons each. 2 were emergency boats. These were also in davits, but were hung outboard, 1 on the starboard side and 1 on the port side, and were designed to carry 40 persons each. The remaining 4 boats were Engelhart or collapsible boats. 2 of these were stowed on the boat deck and 2 on the roof of the officers' quarters, and were designed to carry 47 persons each. Thus, the total boat accommodation was for 1,178 persons. The boats in davits were numbered, the odd numbers being on the starboard side and the even numbers on the port side. The numbering began with the emergency boats, which were forward and ran aft. Thus, the boats on the starboard side were numbered 1, an emergency boat, 3, 5, 7, 9, 11, 13, and 15 lifeboats, and those on the port side 2, an emergency boat, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14, and 16 lifeboats. The collapsible boats were lettered A and B being on the roof of the officers' quarters, and C and D being on the boat deck. C was abreast of number 1, emergency boat, and D abreast of number 2, emergency boat. Further particulars as to the boats will be found on page 18. In ordinary circumstances, all these boats, with the exception of 1 and 2, were kept covered up and contained only a portion of their equipment, such as oars, masts and sails, and water. Some of the remaining portion, such as lamps, compasses, and biscuits, being stowed in the ship in some convenient place, ready for use when required. Much examination was directed at the hearing to showing that some boats left the ship without a lamp, and others without a compass, and so on. But in the circumstances of confusion and excitement which existed at the time of the disaster, this seems to me to be excusable. Each member of the crew had a boat assigned to him in printed lists, which were posted up in convenient places for the men to see. But it appeared that in some cases the men had not looked at these lists and did not know their respective boats. There had been no proper boat drill nor a boat muster. It was explained that great difficulty frequently exists in getting firemen to take part in a boat drill. They regard it as no part of their work. There seem to be no statutory requirements as to boat drills or musters, although there is a provision, Section 9 of the Merchant Shipping Act of 1906, that when a boat drill does take place, the master of the vessel is, under a penalty, to record the fact in his log. I think it is desirable that the Board of Trade should make rules requiring boat drills and boat musters to be held of such a kind and at such times as may be suitable to the ship and to the voyage on which she is engaged. Boat drill, regulated according to the opportunities of the service, should always be held. It is perhaps worth recording that there was an inspection of the boats themselves at Southampton by Mr. Clark, the emigration officer, and that, as a result, Mr. Clark gave his certificate that the boats were satisfactory. For the purpose of this inspection, 2 of the boats were lowered to the water and crews exercised in them. The collision took place at 11:40 p.m., ship's time. About midnight, it was realized that the vessel could not live, and at about 12:05, the order was given to uncover the 14 boats under davits. The work began on both sides of the ship under the superintendence of 5 officers. It did not proceed quickly at first. The crew arrived on the boat deck only gradually, and there was an average of not more than 3 deck hands to each boat. At 12:20, the order was given to swing out the boats, and this work was at once commenced. There were a few passengers on the deck at this time. Mr. Lightoller, who was one of the officers directing operations, says that the noise of the steam blowing off was so great that his voice could not be heard, and that he had to give directions with his hands. Before this work had been begun, the stewards were rousing the passengers in their different quarters, helping them to put on life belts and getting them up to the boat deck. At about 12:30, the order was given to place women and children in the boats. This was proceeded with at once, and at about 12:45, Mr. Murdoch gave the order to lower number 7 boat on the starboard side to the water. The work of uncovering, filling, and lowering the boats was done under the following supervision. Mr. Lowe, the 5th officer, saw to numbers 1, 3, 5, and 7. Mr. Murdoch, lost, saw also to 1 and 7, and to A and C. Mr. Moody, lost, looked after numbers 9, 11, 13, and 15. Mr. Murdoch also saw to 9 and 11. Mr. Lightoller saw to numbers 4, 6, 8, B, and D. Mr. Wilde, lost, also saw to 8 and D. Mr. Lightoller and Mr. Moody saw to 10 and 16, and Mr. Lowe to 12 and 14. Mr. Wilde also assisted at number 14, Mr. Boxall helping generally. The evidence satisfies me that the officers did their work very well and without any thought of themselves. Captain Smith, the master, Mr. Wilde, the chief officer, Mr. Murdoch, the first officer, and Mr. Moody, the sixth officer, all went down with the ship while performing their duties. The others, with the exception of Mr. Lightoller, took charge of boats and thus were saved. Mr. Lightoller was swept off the deck as the vessel went down and was subsequently picked up. So far as can be ascertained, the boats left the ship at the following times, but I think it is necessary to say that these, and indeed all the times subsequent to the collision which are mentioned by the witnesses, are unreliable. Starboard side boats, number 7, 12:46 a.m. Number 5, 12:55 a.m. Number 3, 1 a.m. Number 1, 1:10 a.m. Number 9, 1:20 a.m. Number 11, 1:25 a.m. Number 13, 1:35 a.m. Number 15, 1:35 a.m. Collapsible boat C, 1:40 a.m. Port side boats, number 6, 12:55 a.m. Number 8, 1:10 a.m. Number 10, 1:20 a.m. Number 12, 1:25 a.m. Number 14, 1:30 a.m. Number 16, 1:35 a.m. Number 2, 1:45 a.m. Number 4, 1:56 a.m. Collapsible boat D, 2:05 a.m. As regards the collapsible boats, C and D were properly lowered. As to A and B, which were on the roof of the officer's house, they were left until the last. There was difficulty in getting these boats down to the deck, and the ship had at this time a list. Very few of the deck hands were left in the ship, as they had nearly all gone to man the lifeboats, and the stewards and firemen were unaccustomed to work the collapsible boats. Work appears to have been going on in connection with these two boats at the time that the ship sank. The boats seem to have floated from the deck and to have served in the water as rafts. The following table shows the numbers of the male crew, male passengers, and women and children who, according to the evidence, left the ship in each boat. In 3 or 4 instances, the numbers of women and children are only arrived at by subtracting the numbers of crew and male passengers from the total said to be in the boat. These are in italics. In each case, the lowest figures given are taken. This shows in all 107 men of the crew, 43 male passengers, and 704 women and children, or a total of 854 in 18 boats. In addition, about 60 persons, 2 of whom were women, were said to have been transferred subsequently from A and B collapsible boats to other boats or rescued from the water, making a total of 914 who escaped with their lives. It is obvious that these figures are quite unreliable, for only 712 were in fact saved by the Carpathia, the steamer which came to the rescue at about 4 a.m., and all the boats were accounted for. Another remarkable discrepancy is that of the 712 saved, 189 were in fact men of the crew, 129 were male passengers, and 394 were women and children. In other words, the real proportion of women to men saved was much less than the proportion appearing in the evidence from the boats. Allowing for those subsequently picked up, of the 712 persons saved, only 652 could have left the Titanic in boats, or an average of about 36 per boat. There was a tendency in the evidence to exaggerate the numbers in each boat, to exaggerate the proportion of women to men, and to diminish the number of crew. I do not attribute this to any wish on the part of the witnesses to mislead the court, but to a natural desire to make the best case for themselves and their ship. The seamen who gave evidence were too frequently encouraged when under examination in the witness box to understate the number of crew in the boats. The number of crew actually saved was 189, giving an average of 10 per boat. And if from this figure, the 58 men of the 60 persons above mentioned be deducted, the average number of crew leaving the ship in the boats must still have been at least 7. The probability, however, is that many of the 60 picked up were passengers. The discipline both among passengers and crew during the lowering of the boats was good, but the organization should have been better, and if it had been, it is possible that more lives would have been saved. The real difficulty in dealing with the question of the boats is to find the explanation of so many of them leaving the ship, with comparatively few persons in them. Number 1 certainly left with only 12. This was an emergency boat with a carrying capacity of 40. Number 7 left with only 27, and number 6 with only 28. These were lifeboats with a carrying capacity of 65 each, and several of the others, according to the evidence, and certainly according to the truth, must have left only partly filled. Many explanations are forthcoming, one being that the passengers were unwilling to leave the ship. When the earlier boats left, and before the Titanic had begun materially to settle down, there was a drop of 65 feet from the boat deck to the water, and the women feared to get into the boats. Many people thought that the risk in the ship was less than the risk in the boats. This explanation is supported by the evidence of Captain Rostron of the Carpathia. He says that after those who were saved got on board his ship, he was told by some of them that when the boats first left the Titanic, the people really would not be put in the boats. They did not want to go in. There was a large body of evidence from the Titanic to the same effect, and I have no doubt that many people, particularly women, refused to leave the deck for the boats. At one time, the master appears to have had the intention of putting the people into the boats from the gangway doors in the side of the ship. This was possibly with a view to allay the fears of the passengers, for from these doors the water could be reached by means of ladders, and the lowering of some of the earlier boats, when only partly filled, may be accounted for in this way. There is no doubt that the master did order some of the partly filled boats to row to a position under one of the doors with the object of taking in passengers at that point. It appears, however, that these doors were never opened. Another explanation is that some women refused to leave their husbands. It is said further that the officers engaged in putting the people into the boats feared that the boats might buckle if they were filled. But this proved to be an unfounded apprehension, for one or more boats were completely filled and then successfully lowered to the water. At 12:35, the message from the Carpathia was received announcing that she was making for the Titanic. This probably became known and may have tended to make the passengers still more unwilling to leave the ship, and the lights of a ship, the Californian, which were seen by many people, may have encouraged the passengers to hope that assistance was at hand. These explanations are perhaps sufficient to account for so many of the lifeboats leaving without a full boatload, but I think, nevertheless, that if the boats had been kept a little longer before being lowered, or if the after gangway doors had been opened, more passengers might have been induced to enter the boats. And if women could not be induced to enter the boats ought then to have been filled up with men. It is difficult to account for so many of the lifeboats being sent from the sinking ship in a smooth sea, far from full. These boats left behind them many hundreds of lives to perish. I do not, however, desire these observations to be read as casting any reflection on the officers of the ship or on the crew who were working on the boat deck. They all worked admirably, but I think that if there had been better organization, the results would have been more satisfactory. I heard much evidence as to the conduct of the boats after the Titanic sank, and when there must have been many struggling people in the water. And I regret to say that, in my opinion, some, at all events, of the boats failed to attempt to save lives when they might have done so, and might have done so successfully. This was particularly the case with boat number 1. It may reasonably have been thought that the risk of making the attempt was too great, but it seems to me that if the attempt had been made by some of these boats, it might have been the means of saving a few more lives. Subject to these few adverse comments, I have nothing but praise for both passengers and crew. All the witnesses speak well of their behavior. It is to be remembered that the night was dark. The noise of the escaping steam was terrifying. The peril, though perhaps not generally recognized, was imminent and great, and many passengers who were unable to speak or to understand English were being collected together and hurried into the boats. Conduct of Sir C. Duff Gordon and Mr. Ismay. An attack was made in the course of the inquiry on the moral conduct of 2 of the passengers, namely Sir Cosmo Duff Gordon and Mr. Bruce Ismay. It is no part of the business of the court to inquire into such matters, and I should pass them by in silence if I did not fear that my silence might be misunderstood. The very gross charge against Sir Cosmo Duff Gordon that, having gotten to number 1 boat, he bribed the men in it to row away from drowning people is unfounded. I have said that the members of the crew in that boat might have made some attempt to save the people in the water, and that such an attempt would probably have been successful. But I do not believe that the men were deterred from making the attempt by any act of Sir Cosmo Duff Gordon's. At the same time, I think that if he had encouraged the men to return to the position where the Titanic had foundered, they would probably have made an effort to do so, and could have saved some lives. As to the attack on Mr. Bruce Ismay, it resolved itself into the suggestion that, occupying the position of managing director of the steamship company, some moral duty was imposed upon him to wait on board until the vessel foundered. I do not agree. Mr. Ismay, after rendering assistance to many passengers, found C collapsible, the last boat on the starboard side actually being lowered. No other people were there at the time. There was room for him, and he jumped in. Had he not jumped in, he would merely have added one more life, namely his own, to the number of those lost. The third-class passengers. It had been suggested before the inquiry that the third-class passengers had been unfairly treated, that their access to the boat deck had been impeded, and that when at last they reached that deck, the first and second-class passengers were given precedence in getting places in the boats. There appears to have been no truth in these suggestions. It is no doubt true that the proportion of third-class passengers saved falls far short of the proportion of the first and second class. But this is accounted for by the greater reluctance of the third-class passengers to leave the ship, by their unwillingness to part with their baggage, by the difficulty of getting them up from their quarters, which were at the extreme ends of the ship, and by other similar causes. The interests of the relatives of some of the third-class passengers who had perished were in the hands of Mr. Harbinson, who attended the inquiry on their behalf. He said at the end of his address to the court, "I wish to say distinctly that no evidence has been given in the course of this case which would substantiate a charge that any attempt was made to keep back the third-class passengers. I desire further to say that there is no evidence that when they did reach the boat deck, there was any discrimination practiced either by the officers or the sailors in putting them into the boats. I am satisfied that the explanation of the excessive proportion of third-class passengers lost is not to be found in the suggestion that the third-class passengers were in any way unfairly treated. They were not unfairly treated. Means taken to procure assistance. As soon as the dangerous condition of the ship was realized, messages were sent by the master's orders to all steamers within reach. At 12:15 a.m., the distress signal CQD was sent. This was heard by several steamships and by Cape Race. By 12:25, Mr. Boxall, the fourth officer, had worked out the correct position of the Titanic, and then another message was sent. "Come at once, we have struck a berg." This was heard by the Cunard steamer Carpathia, which was at this time bound from New York to Liverpool and 58 miles away. The Carpathia answered, saying that she was coming to the assistance of the Titanic. This was reported to Captain Smith on the boat deck. At 12:26, a message was sent out. "Sinking, cannot hear for noise of steam." Many other messages were also sent, but as they were only heard by steamers which were too far away to render help, it is not necessary to refer to them. At 1:45, a message was heard by the Carpathia, "Engine room full up to boilers." The last message sent out was CQ, which was faintly heard by the steamer Virginian. This message was sent at 2:17. It thus appears that the Marconi apparatus was at work until within a few minutes of the foundering of the Titanic. Meanwhile, Mr. Boxall was sending up distress signals from the deck. These signals, rockets, were sent off at intervals from a socket by number 1 emergency boat on the boat deck. They were the ordinary distress signals, exploding in the air and throwing off white stars. The firing of these signals began about the time that number 7 boat was lowered, 12:45 a.m., and it continued until Mr. Boxall left the ship at about 1:45. Mr. Boxall was also using a Morse light from the bridge in the direction of a ship whose lights he saw about half a point on the port bow of the Titanic at a distance, as he thought, of about 5 or 6 miles. He got no answer. In all, Mr. Boxall fired about 8 rockets. There appears to be no doubt that the vessel whose lights he saw was the Californian. The evidence from the Californian speaks of 8 rockets having been seen between 12:30 and 1:40. The Californian heard none of the Titanic's messages. She had only one Marconi operator on board, and he was asleep.